Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast sea of dust and rock under the blinding Arizona sun. The wind carried heat instead of relief, scraping against Elias Boone's skin like fine grit. He rode a tired bay horse that hadn't had proper water in 2 days. Both man and animal were on the edge of collapse. Boone's shirt clung to his back, salt lines marking the edges where sweat had dried. His canteen swung empty at his side, bumping his hip with each step of the horse. Elias Boone was 35, though the lines around his eyes made him look older. He had once worked security for a freight company before a robbery gone wrong turned him into a wanted man. His two partners took the money, left him shot in the shoulder, and disappeared into Mexico. Since then, Boone had drifted from one job to another: cattle herding, bounty work, even a stint as a guard for a railroad crew. Anything to stay one step ahead of the law in his past. Now he was running again, not toward anything, but away from what he'd already done. By late afternoon, the heat was unbearable. His lips cracked, his tongue dry as sand. He had heard rumors of spring somewhere east of Red Mesa, water that ran even in the driest months. But the locals warned it was cursed. The Apaches called it a place that claimed souls. Boone didn't care about curses. He cared about living long enough to reach another sunrise. He spotted it first by the shimmer of wet stone. A thin ribbon of water trickled down a shallow cut in the rock. He dismounted slowly, knees stiff, and dropped beside it. His horse lowered its head, nostrils flaring with desperate relief. Boone cupped his hands and drank. The water was cold, shockingly so, and it sent pain through his teeth and down his throat. For a moment, he felt dizzy, the kind of lightheadedness that comes when the body isn't sure if it's saved or doomed. He drank again, slower, watching the surface ripple. He knew better than to stay long. His instincts, honed from years of running, told him to move, to drink, refill the canteen, and get clear before dark. Yet he lingered. The air around the spring felt unnaturally still, like the desert itself was holding its breath. His horse snorted and backed away, uneasy. Boone wiped his face with the back of his hand and muttered to himself, "You're seeing ghosts, boy. Just water." He took off his hat and leaned against the rock, closing his eyes for a moment's rest. When sleep came, it was sudden, the deep, heavy kind that hits when exhaustion wins. And in that sleep, he heard a voice. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even human at first. A soft hum, carried by wind and distance, slowly took shape. A woman's voice, low and calm, whispering words he couldn't quite make out. Then, clear as breath on his ear, "You belong to me." His eyes snapped open. The desert was silent. Only the sound of his horse pawing at the sand broke the stillness. Boone's pulse kicked hard in his chest. He reached for his revolver and scanned the rocks. No one, no footprints, no movement. The light was fading now, stretching the canyon's shadows long and thin. He sat for a long time, gun in hand, eyes sweeping the horizon. The voice still echoed in his mind, not as a dream, but as a warning that refused to fade. Boone wasn't a man who frightened easily. He had been shot, hunted, and left to die before. But this left him unsettled in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't fear of something outside. It was fear that something inside him had changed. He forced himself to think logically. Maybe heat stroke. Maybe the water was tainted. He'd been running on little sleep for days. He packed up, fastened the canteen to his saddle, and mounted his horse. Still, as he rode away from the spring, the land felt different, too quiet, too heavy. The wind no longer moved the same way. He couldn't shake the sense that someone, or something, was watching. As night fell, Boone made camp under a low bluff where the wind couldn't reach. He ate the last of his dried meat and tried not to think about the voice. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shimmer of the spring again and the outline of a woman's face half formed in the water. He didn't believe in spirits. He didn't believe in curses. But when the wind shifted, he thought he heard it again, faint, almost tender, the same words brushing through the dark. "You belong to me." Boone's hand found the revolver at his side. His thumb traced the worn metal as if touch alone could anchor him to something real. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure whether he was running from danger or straight into it. Tomorrow, he told himself, he'd ride west, away from this canyon, away from whatever the hell that spring was. But deep down, in a corner of his mind that had survived too many close calls, he already knew something from that spring had followed him, and it wasn't finished yet. Boone woke at dawn to the thin cry of a hawk circling overhead. The air had cooled during the night, but the taste of dust still clung to his tongue. His horse stood nearby, restless, ears twitching toward the open desert. Boone stirred the ashes of his small fire, poured the last bit of coffee grounds into a tin cup, and stared into the flat horizon. He felt the weight of the canteen hanging from his saddle, heavier than before, as if the water inside carried something more than it should. He tried to push away the thought of the whisper. He told himself it was fatigue, sunstroke, nothing more. But deep down, something about that voice felt too precise, too aware. It had not come from his imagination. It had come from somewhere. And that bothered him more than the thirst, more than the heat. Boone's plan had been simple. Make it to Fort Stanton, find work guarding freight caravans, keep moving. He wanted no part of old ghost tales or tribal curses. Yet as he rode east, the memory of the spring grew heavier with every mile, as if the desert itself wanted to pull him back. By noon, he saw smoke rising from the direction of a canyon far to the south. Thin, gray, and wrong. Not the steady trail of a campfire, but the aftermath of something burned down. He hesitated. His gut told him to avoid it, to ride on and not get involved. But the silence around the smoke made him uneasy. Smoke meant people, and people meant food, water, or trouble. Boone had seen too much death on this land to mistake that kind of stillness for anything good. He turned his horse and rode toward it. The closer he got, the more the air changed, a faint burnt scent of cedar and charred hides. The canyon opened into a shallow valley, and what he saw made him pull the reins hard. The remains of an Apache village lay scattered before him. Huts reduced to black skeletons of timber, pottery shattered across the dirt, and a single torn banner fluttering weakly against a half-burned post. He dismounted and walked his horse through the wreckage, every step slow and deliberate. Flies buzzed around what was left of a cooking pit. No voices, no movement, just heat and ruin. He crouched near a small fire pit, brushing aside ash with the edge of his glove. The embers were cold. Whatever had happened here was recent, no more than a day or two ago. Boone scanned the cliffs around him, revolver half drawn. Nothing. Then a faint noise reached him, a rustle, a cough, too human to be the wind. He followed the sound to a collapsed shelter at the far edge of the village. Part of the roof had caved in, the beams black and sharp as broken spears. He knelt and peered inside. There, pressed against the dirt wall, was a woman. Her left arm was bound tightly with a strip of deerskin, blood seeping through. Her long dark hair was tangled, and turquoise beads glinted faintly in the sunlight filtering through the wreckage. Boone raised both hands slowly, voice steady but soft. "Easy now. I'm not here to hurt you." The woman didn't speak. Her eyes stayed fixed on him, sharp, unblinking, full of exhaustion and defiance all at once. Boone saw fear but not weakness. She had been through hell and was still standing. He gestured to the beam pinning her leg. "If I lift that, you gonna shoot me, or are you gonna let me help?" Her breathing slowed. She hesitated, then gave a single nod. Boone took it as permission. He wedged his shoulder under the beam, grunted, and heaved until it gave way, the wood shifting just enough for her to pull free. She winced but made no sound. Boone stepped back, giving her space. "You got water?" She looked at him, then at his canteen. "From a spring." Her English was broken but clear. Boone frowned. "You know about that?" She nodded once. "No man drinks from there unless the land chooses him." Boone wanted to laugh, but his throat was too dry. "Lady, the land didn't choose me. I was dying of thirst." The woman said nothing. She reached for the canteen, drank carefully, and then capped it again, setting it beside her knee with a kind of respect Boone didn't understand. "My name's Boone," he said. "Elias Boone." She answered after a pause. Aayoka. He noticed how she said it, calm, proud, like it was more than a name. Boone didn't ask what it meant. Instead, he looked around the ruins. What happened here? Soldiers, she said quietly. They came before sunrise. They said our people were hiding rifles. But there were only women and children. Her voice cracked, but she forced it steady again. They burned everything. Boone lowered his head. He'd seen it before, too many times. He'd ridden with patrols that called it keeping order. And every time he watched a village turn to smoke, something inside him hollowed out a little more. Anyone else make out? He asked. She shook her head. Only me. Boone exhaled slowly, glancing toward the horizon. You can't stay here. They might come back. I cannot leave, she said, her tone firm. This is where my family's spirits rest. In the spring, it binds what's left. Boone looked at her, trying to read her meaning. You're saying that spring, it's connected to this place? She nodded again. It is the heart of it. You drank from it. Now you are part of it. Boone shifted uneasily, his jaw tightening. You're saying I'm cursed. I am saying, she replied, you are not free. For a long moment, neither spoke. Boone watched her as she tried to stand, wincing from the pain in her leg. He stepped forward to help, and this time she didn't resist. She was light, but her body trembled from exhaustion. He steadied her with one hand, feeling the tremor in her shoulder. He guided her toward the edge of the canyon, where a half-standing hut offered some shade. They stopped, breathing hard. Boone knew he could leave, ride out before the sun went down, pretend he'd never seen this place, never heard that voice. But something about Aayoka, about her calm refusal to give in, held him there. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe the whisper from the spring hadn't been a dream after all. He unsaddled his horse, built a small fire, and said without looking at her, I'll stay till you can walk. Aayoka didn't thank him. She only nodded, eyes reflecting the firelight. That night, Boone couldn't sleep. The desert was too quiet. The wind didn't move through the canyon anymore. It waited. And somewhere in the back of his mind, between the crackle of the fire and the sound of her breathing, the whisper came again. Faint, familiar, certain. You belong to me. Boone opened his eyes and stared into the darkness, the revolver heavy in his hand. He wasn't sure anymore if the voice was the land's, the woman's, or something that had been waiting for him long before he ever drank from that spring. The first light of morning crept across the canyon floor, painting the ruins of the burned village in pale gold. Boone stirred the coals of the small fire with a stick, adding another handful of dry twigs. Aayoka still slept a few feet away, her breathing slow but uneven. Her injured arm was wrapped in a cleaner strip of cloth now. Boone had rebandaged it during the night, working silently while she drifted in and out of consciousness. He wasn't sure why he cared as much as he did. Maybe it was the first decent thing he'd done in years. He poured some coffee grounds into a tin pot, set it over the flame, and leaned back against a stone. His thoughts circled the same questions. What had happened here exactly? How the soldiers had found this hidden canyon, and why the woman, Aayoka, had survived when no one else had. None of it fit right. The army didn't waste bullets on small Apache settlements unless they were after something. When Aayoka woke, her eyes opened without confusion. She scanned the ground first, then the canyon rim, then him, her instincts sharp, almost feral. Boone noticed it and nodded once, approving quietly. She sat up with a slow breath and pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. Coffee, Boone said, handing her the tin cup. She sniffed it cautiously, then took a sip. Bitter. He gave a short smile. It ain't supposed to taste good. It's supposed to wake you up. She said nothing, just sipped again, her expression unreadable. Boone used the quiet to check her arm. You'll need rest. That cut goes deep. You try working too soon, it'll tear again. I will not rest while this place lies broken, she said firmly. Boone let out a slow exhale. You plan to rebuild this whole damn camp by yourself. Aayoka looked around at the burned posts, the shattered pottery, the blackened stones that still carried the smell of smoke. This was my family's ground. I was born here. It is not dead. The land remembers. I will rebuild what could be rebuilt. Boone respected her conviction, even if he didn't understand it. Then I'll help, he said simply. Her eyes flicked toward him, suspicious at first. Why? He shrugged, poking at the fire. Because leaving you here alone feels wrong. And because I owe this place something, whether I believe your story about that spring or not. She studied him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether he was telling the truth. Boone met her gaze and didn't look away. Finally, she nodded once. By midday, they began to work. Boone gathered what timber could still be used from the ruined huts, stacking the straight pieces and burning the rest. Aayoka sorted through the ashes for tools and containers that could be salvaged. A cracked mortar, a clay bowl, a bundle of stone-tipped arrows she'd hidden under a slab before the soldiers came. Boone noticed how carefully she handled each item, like every fragment was a memory. The work filled the silence between them, but it also eased the tension. Boone spoke little, but he watched her move, deliberate, disciplined, never wasting motion. Despite her injury, she worked until sweat streaked her cheeks and soaked through the deerskin of her dress. In the late afternoon, they stopped to rest near the spring that trickled just beyond the ruins. Boone crouched to refill his canteen, but paused before drinking. The memory of that whisper still lingered. He turned to Aayoka. You really believe that things curse? She looked at the water. Not cursed. Sacred. It binds the living to the land and the dead who remain in it. Those who drink are marked. Their path changes. Boone frowned. You mean they die? Not always, she said quietly. Sometimes they stay. He didn't like the sound of that. I never meant to take anything from you or your people. I just wanted to live long enough to get out of this desert. Aayoka looked at him steadily. The spring gives life. It does not ask why, but when it chooses, there is no running from it. Boone didn't argue. He filled the canteen and capped it tightly. As they walked back toward camp, he noticed the wind shifting through the canyon, cooler now, steadier. The desert around them seemed calmer, as if the place itself acknowledged their work. That night, after they ate, Aayoka tended the fire while Boone sat nearby, cleaning his revolver. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. Boone found himself watching the flames dance across her face, the light catching the turquoise beads woven into her braid. He realized he hadn't spoken to another soul for more than a few hours and months. Tell me something, he said suddenly. Why didn't they kill you? Aayoka didn't look up. I don't know. Perhaps they thought I was already dead. Boone frowned. And what were they looking for? She stirred the fire with a stick. They asked about a man who came through here 2 moons ago. A white man with a scar across his neck. He traded for water and left toward the canyon pass. Boone froze, his hand still holding the revolver. He knew that description too well. It matched Clay Danner, the man who shot him in the shoulder and left him bleeding in the desert after the robbery. The man who took his share and vanished. He said nothing, but his pulse quickened. Maybe it was chance, maybe fate, or maybe that whisper at the spring hadn't been random at all. Aayoka noticed his silence. You know him, she said. Boone looked up slowly. I might. Then your path was never by accident, she said simply. He tried to shake off the feeling creeping through him, but it clung there, heavy and real. He glanced toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, Danner was still alive. And now Boone had a reason to find him. As the fire burned low, Aayoka spread her blanket near the wall of the rebuilt shelter. Boone stayed awake, staring into the darkness. He thought of the spring, the whisper, and the burned village. He had come here running from his past, but the past had somehow found him again, drawn by water that refused to let him go. The desert was quiet, but Boone couldn't rest. Every instinct told him his road was changing. The whisper had marked him, Aayoka had anchored him, and somewhere ahead lay the man who had once betrayed him. For the first time in a long while, Boone felt something close to purpose, not just survival, but a reason to face what he'd been running from. He didn't know yet that before the next dawn, he'd be forced to choose between vengeance and staying to protect the only soul left who believed he could be more than the man he used to be. By dawn, the canyon had cooled, and a thin line of fog hugged the spring like a low, breathing thing. Boone stood at the edge of the water, watching the reflection of his own face in it. He hadn't slept. The memory of Clay Danner's name still rattled in his head like a loose bullet in a tin cup. He'd thought the man was long gone, dead in some saloon shootout or rotting in a shallow grave. But now, knowing Danner had passed through here, that meant Boone's running had never mattered. His past had been riding just a few steps ahead all along. Aayoka approached quietly, her hair still damp from washing in the spring. She carried a small bundle of herbs and strips of dried meat. Her arm had begun to heal, slow but clean. Boone noticed how steady her movements were now, how her strength returned in silence. "You did not sleep," she said, more as an observation than a question. Boone shook his head. "I've been thinking. That man, the one who came through here, I used to ride with him. He's dangerous, Aayoka. If he was looking for this place, he had a reason. Maybe the soldiers were chasing him." Aayoka's gaze dropped to the water. "Then the spring called you for a reason." Boone frowned. "You keep saying that like the damn water knows what it's doing to—" She looked at him, calm and unwavering. "It does." He exhaled hard, rubbing the back of his neck. "You really believe I was meant to find you?" Aayoka didn't answer right away. "You carry guilt," she said finally. "It follows you like a shadow. Perhaps the spring saw that and decided you should stay." Boone wanted to argue, but couldn't. She was right. He did carry guilt. About the robbery, the men he'd killed, the ones he hadn't saved. About the life he'd never tried to fix. Instead of replying, he turned toward the camp. "We need to move your things. If soldiers come back, they'll see the smoke from miles off." They spent the morning rebuilding higher up the canyon, closer to the stone ridges. Boone used leftover timber to construct a shelter with a solid roof beam. He set traps along the lower path and built a hidden pit for storing supplies. Aayoka gathered herbs, tanned the hair hides Boone had caught, and wove thin cords from yucca fibers. They worked without needing to speak much. Each movement practical, direct, almost like they'd done this before in another life. By midday, the sound of distant thunder rolled across the desert. A storm was coming from the north, rare but fierce when it struck. Boone checked the sky and cursed softly. "We'll need to cover the firewood and tie down the lean-to. When the rain hits, the canyon floods." Aayoka nodded, but Boone noticed the faint tension in her face. Not fear, but unease. "What is it?" he asked. "Rain washes away signs," she said. "Tracks, memories, voices of those who were here. It hides everything." Boone paused at that. "Sometimes hiding's not the worst thing." She met his eyes. "For me, it is." By the time the storm reached them, the air smelled of iron and wet dust. Lightning cracked far off, flashing blue-white against the cliffs. They took shelter beneath the newly built roof, their small fire struggling to stay alive. Rain came hard, pounding on the wooden planks like fists. The sound filled the canyon, drowning out all else. Boone sat near the entrance, watching the water rush through the gullies. Aayoka stayed beside the fire, her hands clasped tight around a small carved amulet that hung from her neck, turquoise and bone-bound with rawhide. Boone nodded toward it. "That means something." She hesitated, then held it up. "It belonged to my mother. It's the last thing I have left. When someone in my family dies, we burn a token for them. But when the body is gone, we wear it instead to carry their spirit." Boone's eyes softened. "You lost everyone, didn't you?" "Yes," she said quietly. "But the land remembers." He looked at her, at the faint reflection of the fire in her eyes. "Maybe," he said, "but memory doesn't always mean peace." When the storm finally passed, the canyon was changed. The air smelled clean, the ground dark and glistening. The ashes of the burned village had washed into small black streams that cut through the sand. Aayoka walked out barefoot, her feet sinking slightly in the wet earth. Boone followed her, scanning the horizon. "What are you looking for?" he asked. "Signs," she said. "The land speaks after rain. You just have to listen." Boone almost smiled. Never had much luck listening to things that don't talk back. But then Aayoka stopped suddenly and knelt beside a flat patch of mud. Boone joined her and saw it. 3 sets of hoof prints, fresh, cutting through the softened ground. They were deep, too heavy for strays. Riders. Boone's stomach tightened. "They came through here recently." Aayoka nodded, her voice steady. 2 days, maybe less. Boone knelt closer, studying the tracks. One horse dragged slightly, the same pattern Danner's old bay used to leave. He knew it instantly. His pulse climbed. "That's him," he said under his breath. Aayoka looked at him. "Then he is close." Boone stood, jaw set. "Too close. We need to be ready." They spent the next hours preparing the canyon for defense. Boone reinforced the camp's entrance with a wall of stones. Aayoka helped him set traps, tripwires tied to fallen logs, sharp stakes hidden beneath sand. Boone showed her how to reload his spare revolver, how to aim steady, how to shoot without flinching. She learned fast, calm, and focused. As evening came, they sat by the fire once more, silent but aware of what was coming. Boone cleaned his rifle methodically, each motion smooth and practiced. Aayoka braided her hair tightly, tying it back with a leather cord. "Will you kill him?" she asked quietly. Boone didn't look up. "If I have to." She watched him for a long moment, then said, "The spring does not bind you to death, Elias. It binds you to choice." Boone gave a short, humorless laugh. "That's what you call it? Choice?" "Yes," she said simply. "You can still decide what kind of man you will be when the past finds you." Her words settled over him like dust. He didn't reply. He just sat there, staring into the flames until his reflection blurred. By the time the fire burned low, Boone had made his decision. He would face Danner, not to run him down in hate, but to end the trail that had haunted them both. He owed Aayoka the safety she'd lost, and he owed himself the right to stop running. Above them, the night cleared. The moon rose bright over the canyon, and for the first time in years, Boone didn't feel like a man on the run. He felt anchored to the land, to the fire, to the woman who believed he could still be redeemed. He didn't yet know that before the next day's sun reached the ridge, 3 riders would enter the canyon, one of them a ghost from his past, and every choice he had made since drinking from the forbidden spring would come to bear its weight. The sun had barely touched the canyon rim when Boone opened his eyes. The fire had burned down to gray ash, and the air carried that still tension that comes before trouble. He sat up quietly, checked his rifle, and listened. The sound came faint but sure. Hooves, 3 horses, moving slow through the canyon mouth. Boone's instincts sharpened like a blade. He knew that rhythm. Danner always led from the front, with 1 light rider behind and a 3rd keeping distance to watch the flanks. He'd taught Boone that tactic himself years ago, back when they rode as partners, before greed split the line between them. Boone stood, pulled on his hat, and loaded the last 2 cartridges into the rifle. Aayoka was already awake, standing at the edge of the shelter, bow in hand. Her calm made him uneasy. She looked like she'd expected this moment all along. "They're here," Boone said quietly. "I know," she replied. "The land warned me last night." He glanced at her, but didn't argue. There was something about her presence that had stopped surprising him. What once seemed like superstition now felt like a fact of survival. Boone crouched low, scanning the ridgeline. Dust drifted through the air, stirred by movement beyond the rocks. He pointed toward a narrow trail that wound into the canyon's throat. "When they come through that pass, we'll have 1 shot at catching them off guard. You stay here. If they break through, use the revolver. Keep it low and steady." Aayoka met his eyes. "You do not need to face him alone." Boone gave a thin smile. "This ain't about needing to. It's about finishing what I should have done years ago." She didn't respond, but her jaw tightened. Boone could tell she understood, maybe more than he wanted her to. By the time the first rider appeared, the sun was high enough to cast sharp light across the canyon. The lead horse was a dark bay with a limp in its front leg. Boone recognized it instantly. Then he saw the man, Clay Danner, his face tanned, eyes hidden beneath the brim of a black hat. The scar across his neck caught the light like a white thread. Boone's stomach turned cold. Behind Danner rode 2 others, young, reckless-looking men armed with repeating rifles. They scanned the cliffs, but didn't expect an ambush. Boone watched them pass the first trap line, a stretch of loose stones he'd rigged to collapse under weight. He waited. Then one of the horses stumbled, hooves striking the hidden tripwire. A small avalanche of rock cascaded down, spooking the horses. The men cursed, drawing their rifles, but Boone was already up and firing. His first shot struck the rear rider's shoulder, spinning him out of the saddle. The second round hit the front of Danner's horse, forcing it to rear. Gunfire erupted across the canyon. Echoes clashed and rolled like thunder. Boone dropped behind cover, worked the bolt, and fired again. A bullet grazed his hat brim. Another kicked dust inches from his knee. He gritted his teeth, aimed carefully, and squeezed off 2 more rounds. One struck the younger gunman's rifle, shattering it in his hands. The man bolted toward the wash, bleeding and terrified. Danner stayed mounted, shouting Boone's name through the gunfire. "You alive, Boone? I figured the desert took you years ago." Boone's voice came out steady, low, and cold. It tried. A silence followed, heavy and tense. Boone moved to a better position behind a cluster of rocks. Danner dismounted slowly, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Didn't figure you'd hide behind some burned-down Indian camp," Danner said, his tone sharp and mocking. "You always did have a knack for bad company." Boone didn't rise to the bait. "You passed through here weeks ago. You led the soldiers to this place, didn't you?" Danner laughed. "I didn't lead him. I just told them what they wanted to hear. There was bounty on Apache raiders, Boone. I gave him a location. Easy money." Boone's jaw tightened. "They were women and children." "War don't care," Danner said coldly. "Neither should you. We stopped caring a long time ago." Boone stepped out from cover then, his rifle steady. "You're wrong. I started caring the day you left me for dead." The 2 men faced each other across the canyon floor, the past standing in the present, raw and unflinching. For a brief moment, the desert went still again. The gunfire broke the silence first. Danner fired from a hip. Boone dove sideways and returned fire. Bullets tore through the air, kicking up shards of stone. Boone rolled behind a fallen log and chambered his last round. Danner advanced, firing, laughing. The same wild sound Boone remembered from the robbery, the sound of a man who thought he couldn't die. Then from behind Danner came another gunshot, clear, precise. Danner's shoulder jerked back. Aayoka stood on the ridge above, revolver raised, smoke curling from the barrel. Boone seized the moment, stepped from cover, and aimed for Danner's hand. The shot knocked the revolver from his grip. "Enough!" Boone shouted. Danner staggered, clutching his wound, eyes wild. "You think you're better than me, Boone? We're the same. We always were." Boone walked forward slowly, lowering his rifle. His voice stayed calm, but the words carried years of weight. "No, I was you once. Not anymore." He swung the rifle like a staff, striking Danner across the jaw. The man dropped to his knees, blood on his teeth. Boone aimed again, ready to finish it, but stopped. He thought of Aayoka watching from above, of the spring, of the curse she called a choice. He hesitated, breathing hard. Danner spat blood and laughed weakly. "Can't do it, can you?" Boone's eyes narrowed. "No, but I can make sure you face what you did." He tied Danner's hands with rawhide, dragged him toward the camp, and kicked his fallen gun into the mud. The second rider was gone, fled into the desert. The first lay wounded near the rocks, bleeding but alive. Boone ignored him for now. When they reached the shelter, Aayoka was already there, waiting, her expression unreadable. She looked from Boone to Danner and back again. "You spared him," she said quietly. Boone nodded. "He'll hang in Silver Creek. Let the law finish what I started." Aayoka's gaze lingered on Danner. "And you? Does this end your running?" Boone looked at the horizon. The storm had cleared, the sky wide and clean. "I reckon it does." He turned to her, voice low. "You were right. The spring didn't curse me. It showed me I still had a choice." For the first time since he'd met her, Aayoka's face softened into something that wasn't pain or anger. It was peace. "Then stay," she said. "Help me rebuild. Let the land remember new things." Boone studied her, the canyon, the ashes of what once was, and the clear water glinting just beyond the ridge. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a ghost wandering through borrowed ground. He felt present. Danner groaned behind them, the sound breaking the silence. Boone didn't turn. He simply said, "You'll get your trial, but your days of running are done." The desert wind carried the words across the canyon, soft but final. That night, Boone sat beside Aayoka by the fire. Neither spoke. The only sound was the steady crackle of wood and the low hum of the spring in the distance. He stared into the flames, thinking about all that had been taken and all that could still be rebuilt. He knew the hardest part was over. The rest, for once, might actually belong to them. Far off in the dark, a coyote called, and for the first time since he'd come to this place, Boone didn't reach for his gun. He just listened. The morning after the gunfight broke with a calm Boone hadn't felt in years. The sky stretched wide and silver blue, the air cool and still, carrying only the faint scent of wet sand and burnt powder. He sat near the dying fire, cleaning his rifle out of habit more than need. The motion kept his thoughts steady. Behind him, Danner lay tied to a post, hands bound tight, a rough bandage on his shoulder. The man had barely spoken since the fight, his usual arrogance dulled into a quiet, bitter stare. Aayoka moved silently between the fire and the small table Boone had built from scavenged planks. She crushed herbs with a stone, mixing them into a bowl of warm water. "You should rest," she said without looking up. "You did not sleep." Boone shook his head. "I'll sleep when we get him to the sheriff." She stopped what she was doing and turned toward him. And after that, Boone didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure. He had told himself that bringing Danner in would settle everything. His guilt, his running, the hollow years of violence and regret. But now that it was nearly done, there was no peace in it, only a quiet emptiness he didn't yet know how to fill. After that, he finally said, "I reckon I'll stay a while." Aayoka nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried more trust than words. She returned to her work, wringing the cloth and tending to Danner's wound. Boone watched her with a quiet respect. She didn't treat Danner with kindness exactly, more like necessity. Every movement was controlled, professional. Boone wondered how many times she'd done this before, for family, for strangers, for enemies. Danner looked at her as she worked. "You're wasting your time, lady," he muttered, voice hoarse. "I'll hang either way." Aayoka didn't look up, then die clean. Boone almost smiled at that. She had a way of ending things with so few words. By midday, Boone saddled the horses and packed what little food they had left. The trip to Silver Creek would take 2 days if the weather held. He tied Danner's hands to the pommel and mounted his own horse. Aayoka came out carrying a small pouch of supplies, dried meat, herbs, and flint. "You sure about coming?" Boone asked. "It'll be rough riding." "I will come," she said firmly. "The spring chose both of us. I do not leave until it releases you." Boone didn't argue. Deep down, he didn't want her to stay behind anyway. Something about her steadied him, reminded him that he wasn't the same man who had drunk from that spring weeks ago. They rode through the open desert, the horizon wide and empty. Danner rode in silence between them, his shoulders tense, his face pale. Boone could tell he was losing strength from the wound, but he didn't slow the pace. He wanted this done before nightfall, before doubt could creep in again. When the sun dropped low, they made camp in a dry arroyo. Boone tethered the horses and built a small fire while Aayoka tended to the prisoner. She spoke little, her focus on keeping Danner alive just long enough to face judgment. Boone watched the two of them, the woman whose people had been destroyed by soldiers Danner helped, and the man who'd once been his partner in crime, sitting only feet apart. The world had strange ways of closing circles. After a long silence, Danner spoke. "You really think handing me over fixes anything, Boone?" Boone didn't look up. "Ain't about fixing things. It's about owning what we broke." Danner gave a dry laugh. "You still think you're better than me?" Boone met his gaze, his expression flat. "No, I just think I finally stopped being you." The words seemed to hit harder than a punch. Danner turned away, muttering something Boone didn't catch. Aayoka glanced at Boone briefly, a look that said she understood more than either man would ever admit aloud. Later, when the fire burned low, Boone sat apart from the camp, watching the moon rise over the sand flats. The night was quiet except for the creak of leather and the faint whisper of wind through the brush. He thought about the spring again, the moment he'd drunk from it, the whisper that followed, the feeling that his life had been claimed by something unseen. He still didn't believe in curses, but he believed in consequences. Maybe that was enough. Aayoka joined him quietly, sitting beside the fire. "You wonder if it was fate," she said, reading his thoughts as if they were her own. Boone nodded slowly. "I wonder if any of this means something, or if I just got lucky enough to crawl this far." "It means something," she said. "You were lost when you came here. Now you walk with purpose. That is what the spring gives, not freedom, but direction. He stared at her for a long moment. And what about you? He asked. You gonna stay here when this is over? Ayoka's eyes reflected the firelight. My people are gone. The land is what remains. I stay because it remembers them. And because now it remembers you too. Boone turned back toward the horizon. The idea settled heavy in his chest. That he might finally belong somewhere. Not because of what he'd done, but because someone had decided to see more in him than a gun and a past. The next morning, they reached the edge of Silver Creek, a small frontier town built from dust and timber, its streets lined with wagons and the faint echo of hammer strikes from a smithy. The sheriff's office stood at the far end, a square building with a single flag fluttering lazily in the heat. Boone dismounted, helped Aayoka down, and pulled Danner from his saddle. The man could barely stand. The sheriff, a gray-bearded man named Harlan Tate, stepped out onto the porch and eyed the trio. Elias Boone, he said, recognition flickering across his face. Didn't expect to see you alive, let alone dragging in the man you used to ride with. Boone tipped his hat. Things change. Tate nodded, looking at Danner. So I hear, you're bringing him in for the stagecoach robbery? And for what he did to her people, Boone added quietly. The sheriff's expression darkened. I heard about that raid. We'll see that justice is done. Boone handed over the rope, and two deputies led Danner inside. The man didn't fight. He just looked back at Boone once, something between hatred and resignation in his eyes, before disappearing behind the door. When it was done, Boone turned to Aayoka. The town noise buzzed faintly around them, the sound of normal life continuing, unaware of what it had cost elsewhere. It's over, he said. Aayoka looked at him, her expression calm but unreadable. No, it begins. He frowned slightly, unsure what she meant, but she didn't explain. She simply walked ahead, her hand brushing against the amulet at her chest. Boone followed her to the edge of town. They stopped by the river that ran shallow and slow through the valley. The water caught the light just like the spring had, clear and quiet. Boone took off his hat, feeling the breeze move through his hair. You think I'm free now? He asked. Aayoka looked at him with a faint, knowing smile. You were never bound. You just needed to remember who you were before you ran. For the first time in years, Boone let himself breathe without the weight of guilt pressing against his ribs. The whisper from the spring was gone now, replaced by something quieter but far more real. Peace. They stood there together as the wind rippled across the water, and in that still moment, Boone knew the desert hadn't cursed him. It had given him a reason to stop running, and a person to share the silence with. And somewhere deep in the canyons behind them, the forbidden spring flowed on, silent, eternal, watching its debt finally repaid. Boone stayed in Silver Creek longer than he planned. What was supposed to be a simple handover stretched into days, then nearly a week. The sheriff needed a formal statement, and there were questions about the robbery, the soldiers' raid, and why Boone had been off the grid for so long. Sheriff Tate knew Boone's past well enough to suspect there was more to the story, but he was a fair man. He'd seen too many drifters burn out trying to outrun what they'd done. You've done a bad man's work for a long time, Tate had told him one evening while filling out the last of the reports. Maybe it's time you try something else. Boone had only nodded. There wasn't much else to say. He'd told his side of it plain. The betrayal, the killing, the spring, the Apache woman. The sheriff didn't ask if Boone believed in curses. He didn't need to. He could see that something had changed in the man sitting across from him. By the end of that week, Danner was locked in a cell waiting for transport to Yuma prison. Boone went to see him one last time. The cell was small, dim, the iron bars catching the weak morning light. Danner sat on the cot, pale and hollow-eyed, his shoulder bound tight. You get what you wanted, Danner said, voice thin. They'll hang me. Boone leaned against the bars. They'll judge you. What happens after that's between you and God. Danner gave a humorless grin. You think that spring washed you clean, Boone? You think one good deed makes up for the rest? Boone met his eyes steadily. No, but it's a start. He turned and walked out, not looking back. For the first time since the desert, Danner didn't call after him. Outside, Aayoka waited near the horses, her presence quiet but grounding. She had spent her time in town, avoiding the curious stares of townsfolk. Her deerskin dress, turquoise beads, and calm defiance standing out against the wooden storefronts and polished boots of settlers. Yet she carried herself as if she belonged there more than anyone else. When Boone approached, she studied him carefully. "It is done." He nodded. "It's done. Then we return," she said. "Return to the canyon. The land does not end its story just because men do." Boone exhaled and looked toward the horizon. Part of him wanted to stay. Silver Creek had its comforts, its order, a kind of safety he hadn't felt in years. But that wasn't who he was. Not yet. They rode out the next morning before sunrise, following the same trail back across the dry plains. The desert had changed since the storm, greener in patches, quiet in a way that felt almost welcoming. Boone found himself noticing small things he'd never cared about before. The way sunlight caught on mesquite leaves, the sound of wind moving through open rock. When they reached the canyon, the air was still and warm. The charred remains of the village were gone now, washed away by rain and time. Only the new structures Boone had helped build stood upright, solid and square against the red stone. Aayoka dismounted first, kneeling near the spring. Boone watched as she dipped her hand into the water and touched her forehead. "It remembers you," she said softly. Boone crouched beside her. "And what's it say?" "That your debt is paid. The land has accepted you." Boone didn't answer right away. He stared into the water, seeing the reflection of his weathered face and the faint ripple of her hand beside it. "When I drank from this, I thought I'd curse myself." "You did," she said, "but not the way you think. It cursed you with remembrance, with seeing who you really are." He gave a faint laugh under his breath. "That's a hard thing to live with. It is also the only way to live right." They spent the next few days restoring what remained of the camp. Boone hauled wood from the nearby ridge, fixed the roof on the second hut, and mended the corral fence. Aayoka replanted herbs and corn along the creek bed, marking each small mound with a stone. Their work was steady, silent, but meaningful, the kind that built something inside as much as it built outside. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Boone asked the question that had lingered since that first night. "You said the spring binds those who drink. Does that mean I can't leave?" Aayoka looked at him for a long time before answering. "You could leave, but you won't." He tilted his head. "How can you be so sure?" "Because you stopped running," she said simply. Boone didn't argue. He stared at the fire instead, watching the flames lick around the stones. He thought about the men he'd killed, the people he'd failed, and the woman sitting beside him, someone who had lost everything yet still chose to rebuild. It struck him then that the curse had never been about death or fate. It had been about responsibility, about learning to stay when every instinct told him to walk away. The days blended into a rhythm. Boone hunted, repaired tools, and learned to listen when Aayoka spoke about the land, which plants healed burns, which winds meant rain, which silences carried warnings. In turn, she learned from him how to aim a rifle steady, how to track by boot prints, how to survive in a world that didn't always show mercy. One night, when the sky burned orange with the last light, Boone stood by the spring, the same place where it all began. Aayoka joined him, her steps soft on the sand. "You regret it?" she asked. He thought for a long moment, then shook his head. "No, I don't, even though it brought you pain." He gave a faint smile. "Pain's part of it. Always was. But this," he gestured toward the camp, the spring, the quiet canyon around them. "This feels like it's worth something." Aayoka's expression softened. "Then you have found what the spring wanted you to find." Boone looked at her, and in her calm, he saw the strength that had carried both of them through the worst of the desert. He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain again, faint, distant, promising. Aayoka turned toward the sky, smiling slightly. Boone stood beside her, his hat low against the light, his revolver finally resting on the table inside the cabin instead of his hip. For the first time in his life, he wasn't preparing to leave. He was simply standing still, where the land had claimed him, where his story had come full circle. And though the desert never forgot, it had at last forgiven. Weeks passed, and the canyon changed with the season. Grass pushed through the ash-black soil where the burned village once lay, and birds returned to the ridges. The sound of running water from the spring no longer felt ominous to Boone. It was steady, alive, and grounding. What had begun as a place of fear was now a place of work, silence, and peace. Boone had built 3 solid cabins by then, one for storage, one for living, and one for trade. He had even carved a small sign above the main door, Silver Creek Outpost. It wasn't much, but it meant something. Travelers passing through could stop for water, trade for food, or rest before heading north. The spring that had once been forbidden was now open to those who needed it, with Aayoka's blessing. She said that was the way it was meant to be. Water should never belong to just one soul. Sometimes, Boone would catch her watching the horizon at dawn, her braids swaying in the light wind, her expression distant. She still carried the weight of her people, even in quiet moments. But Boone had noticed something new in her, the faint ease of someone who had found balance. She no longer spoke of spirits or vengeance. She spoke of growth, of the land healing, of what could still be built. They'd talk in the evenings by the fire. Boone told her about his old life, the mines in Nevada, the robberies, the long years of drift. He told her how guilt had become the only thing keeping him alive. She listened without judgment, sometimes asking questions, sometimes saying nothing at all. One night, as the firelight flickered across their faces, she said, "The spring bound you to this land so you would see what remains when a man stops running." Boone nodded slowly. "And you? What did it bind you to?" She thought for a moment. To remember that not all outsiders destroy. Some stay. Some help rebuild. He looked at her then, truly looked, at the scars on her arm, the strength in her eyes, the quiet steadiness in how she held herself. He realized that what had begun as a shared need for survival had become something deeper, a trust forged through silence, not words. The following morning, a wagon appeared on the ridge, 2 settlers from Silver Creek. They came seeking Boone's help. Word of the rebuilt camp had spread. Folks said a man and an Apache woman had turned a burned ruin into a safe outpost. The settlers brought tools, seed, and a promise to trade goods for water and protection. Boone accepted. For the first time in years, he was part of something that didn't involve a gun. That night, as they unloaded supplies, Aayoka watched him speak with the settlers, calm, steady, almost like a man who had lived here all his life. When the others turned in, she said softly, "You have become what the spring saw in you." Boone smiled faintly. Maybe it just saw a tired man who needed a place to stop. "No," she said. "It saw a man who could stay." Her words stayed with him. Over the next months, life found its rhythm. The outpost grew into a small settlement. Nothing grand, but honest. 2 more families joined them. Children played near the creek, their laughter echoing against the canyon walls. The water that once carried a curse now gave life to crops and people alike. Still, sometimes Boone would walk alone at dusk to the edge of the spring. He'd stare at his reflection in the rippling surface and remember the man who first drank from it. Desperate, hunted, half dead. That man was gone now. The scars remained, but they no longer owned him. One evening, after a long day of work, Boone returned to find Aayoka sitting outside, weaving a thin cord of leather and turquoise beads. She handed it to him without a word. "What's this?" he asked. "A promise," she said. "To the land. To me. To yourself." Boone turned the bracelet in his hand. Simple, strong, and made with care. He tied it around his wrist and said quietly, "Then I reckon I'll keep it." The sky dimmed to violet as the sun dropped behind a ridge. The smell of rain was in the air again, gentle, familiar. Boone looked toward the horizon, then back to her. "You ever think about leaving this place?" he asked. Aayoka smiled faintly. "The land is big enough to walk, but small enough to return. I will not leave what still remembers me." Boone nodded. "Then I'll stay too." And he did. When spring returned, the first flowers bloomed around the water's edge. Travelers passing through the canyon would sometimes speak of a quiet man with gray eyes and a woman in deerskin tending a spring that never ran dry. They said the place had a strange calm to it, as if time itself slowed there. Years later, when the sheriff's riders stopped by, They found the outpost thriving, a small but peaceful settlement. Boone met them with the same calm he always carried. He no longer wore his gun at his side. Instead, it hung on the cabin wall, cleaned and oiled but untouched. As the riders left, one of them asked, "You ever think about going back east, Boone? Starting over proper?" Boone had smiled then, his eyes steady. "I already did." That night, as the fire crackled and the stars spread wide above the canyon, Aayoka rested her head on his shoulder. The whisper that once haunted Boone was gone, replaced by the soft rush of water and the steady rhythm of life around them. He closed his eyes and breathed deep, the scent of earth, cedar, and rain mixing in the air. For the first time in his life, there were no debts, no ghosts, no questions left unanswered. The man who drank from the forbidden spring had found what he was never meant to find: peace, belonging, and a home that would outlast them both. And when the wind moved through the canyon that night, it carried no whisper, only the sound of two lives rebuilt where the desert had once burned everything away.